Hello, folks. You're listening to Race Matters, and I'm Eddie Carson. I'm the host, and I'm excited, like I am every week, for us to delve into the nomenclature of thinking about race, class, gender, and the scholarship and the elements that really have come to divide us, but yet really to surgically think about the ways when we explore culture and historical phenomena that pulls us together, things that really promote and create conversations that are there. I'm glad that you are here listening at Joppa Radio, Newburyport, Massachusetts 96.3. You can find this episode and other episodes of the podcast Race Matters at SoundCloud, on YouTube, and on my website at professorcarson.com. Folks, I'm pretty excited, as I am every single week, because it's always about bringing a good funk here. So we like to think about a little bit, and we got a great guest. We have here Professor Brian Kwoba, who is currently an associate professor of history and the director of African and African American studies at the University of Memphis in Tennessee. His scholarship really focuses on a political thought, the social movements among various peoples, particularly people of African descent in the United States, and of course, that diaspora across the globe. This brother is really just doing some really good stuff, kind of leaning in and thinking about how he is going to do that journey of being an activist, thinking about decolonization, thinking about norms and notion of peace building, immigration, or at least immigrant rights, socialism, climate justice, and all of those things that center around the movement, particularly for Black lives. My friend, Professor, welcome to the fold. Brian, how are we doing?
I'm doing great, Professor Carson. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be on your program.
Well, I'm excited. And one of the things we're going to do is, folks, I got a chance to get Brian's book on Hubert Harrison. And I don't know how much y'all know about this brother or not. I'm privy to know a little bit, but after reading this book, I know a lot more, which is fascinating. And we're going to delve into this. We're also going to delve into really a little bit about Brian and his background and really his sojourn that brought him to this point too. So, my friend, it is great to have you here as we delve in. And one thing I just want to go ahead and start off by asking you is, if you will, before we get into the book, tell us a little bit about your story. And what I mean by your story is, where are you from? How did you come to engage in thinking about African and African American studies and to be a thoughtful scholar on this stuff?
Absolutely, absolutely. I my dad is Kenyan and my mom is white American, and so I grew up, with a sort of mixed heritage in that sense. I grew up mostly with my mother. My parents split when I was very young. And so initially, the first years of my life, I didn't really have a strong Kenyan identity or African identity. I had never been to Kenya, I didn't have a great relationship with my dad for most of my life. So that only came later. But when I was in college, so I grew up mostly in Boulder, Colorado. A couple of years spent in Cincinnati, Ohio during elementary school, but Boulder is really what I claim for my hometown. And I didn't really I didn't have a very diverse experience in schools. As I mentioned, my mom is a white American of British descent, and Boulder is a mostly white, area, as far as my friends, my family members, cousins, aunts, uncles, grandmother, schools. I was one of two black students in my high school, basically, so I didn't have a strong racial awareness or consciousness until really I got to college. And that's when, I was at Cornell University, Ithaca, New York for my undergrad. And that's where I first, started engaging with, a community of Black students, first of all, at the university, and of course, a broader Black community in Ithaca beyond the university. But questions of racial identity and belonging really became sharpened there because, it was kind of like, oh, who do I fit in with, right? Which group of students, which, who am I comfortable around? And then I went to Cuba in the summer between my junior and senior years as part of a research trip studying music. I was into jazz, Afro-Cuban music, and ended
Loving
up,
it.
yeah. I went to study music, and I did study music, but it also raised a number of political and historical questions for me just being there, which I'd never thought of before because I think I had internalized a certain kind of Cold War mentality about Cuba. The experience of being there raised a number of questions that, my 21-year-old self, or however old I was, wasn't able to answer. So when I got back from Cuba for my senior year, I took a couple courses in politics and in political thought because I wanted to understand, why it is that the US and Cuban governments were so hostile to one another over a decade after the ending of the Cold War, right? Like that just didn't make sense to me. I couldn't add that up. And so, yeah, basically, to make a longer story shorter, the Cuba experience became the spark for a kind of political awakening and radicalization that happened, as I said, during my senior year at Cornell, where I started reading people like Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky, joined a socialist organization, the International Socialist Organization. And through that, I got a rigorous training in, obviously the organization had its problems, some of which were fatal, and that's why the ISO no longer exists. But that said, for the few years that I was in it, before I left, I got a rigorous training in Marxist theory, in, revolutionary history, and working class politics. And things have been invaluable to me ever since because it's allowed me to not only unpack the world as it's been unfolding for the past 20 years since I graduated Cornell, but also to approach Hubert Harrison and my new book, not just from a scholarly perspective, but as an activist, right? As someone who has been active in various different social movements on a number of different fronts, all of which is wisdom and insight that I feel like I channeled into the book because it covers, as you said, the book covers everything from, the status of Black life in the United States to climate justice issues,
Yes.
right? And everything in between. So, yeah, really looking forward to digging in with you. And my question to you,
Yeah, far away.
would be, would you recommend this book to others? And if so, why?
I appreciate that. And absolutely, I was excited when I got a copy of it and I delved into it. And I'm going to say some stuff. And brother, like I tell people, I don't want to embarrass you or make you blush or anything like that. But the way you use words, just the transition and the finesse of the scholarship that's there is just incredible. And for me, I would say a couple things to people. One, here's why I would get it because you probably don't know a lot about Hubert Harrison,
Hmm.
right? I'm going to say that I think that is true for a lot of people. They don't know much about the brother
Yeah.
at all. And I'll say another reason folks should get it is because as I delved in, I started to learn and thinking about things that I didn't really fully know nor quite grasp as well. One of the things you did exceptionally well in that book is you painted a picture of this activist, this radical, this intellectual, but yet you took him and you separated him from other folks and you made him uniquely different. A good example I'll give you is the fact that you did a great job reminding us why he's not W.E.B. Du Bois.
Hmm.
Of course, you did a good job also leaning into his criticisms of Du Bois too
Uh,
and
mhm.
everything, right? But also, right, their sojourn and how they are connected though through the challenges of what does it mean to be black in America. Same with Booker T. Washington. Same with Marcus Garvey, right? And you painted that in such an exceptional way that it was just brilliant. And the other thing I'll say too is the relevancy of the work, right? As a scholar, as a historian, you're writing about the past because that's what we do, but yet you're shaping a pattern of future trajectory and historical phenomena that exists in the present and the future,
Hmm.
allowing us to know why this is relevant.
Mm,
All right, and
mm,
it's something we're going to get to a little bit later that connects to that. So that's my
mhm.
long-winded way of telling folks. Absolutely. I read your book in 2 days. 2 days.
Wow, that's
I
quite
sit
a
down and people, when I say 2 days, I mean, you're talking about over 300 page, and I just sat there and I just, and I was captured from the beginning, particularly the way you use the word crystallized.
uh-huh,
And
uh-huh.
I was like, okay, right? We're gonna
Yep.
take this, thinking about a stone and all of this stuff too. So
Wow, that's beautiful, man. That's what a vote of confidence, to anytime you read a book that fast, surely it must be captivating or compelling on some level.
well, and there are things in there that I'll sit in there making notes about stuff that I need to go back to and I need to cite out of here. Things I didn't know.
Uh-huh.
And there are a number of things. I'm just going to raise my hand and say there are a number of things I didn't know. Were there.
Hmm.
You know how you
Yeah.
know a little bit about something, then you get to know a brother like you who put together a wonderful book and stuff. I don't know anything.
Yeah, well, that's one of the challenges, but also the joys of writing a book like this, is that it forced me to learn a lot that I didn't know and research things that I never would have researched otherwise. I mean, Hubert Harrison is an extraordinary figure to study because he'll kick you in the pants, in a good
Yes.
way, right? His multidimensionality forces you to explore dimensions of politics and social life that you might otherwise not be thinking about. And so that was a challenge in a lot of ways, but also it's a joy because now I get to share this work with the world. I've been working on this book for over a decade. It
Oh,
started out
wonderful.
it started out as my PhD dissertation at Oxford back in 2013. And so it's been a long journey, but I'm excited to finally release it into the world and get the feedback from folks and engage as we're about to do here.
Well, and when we think about Harrison, oftentimes, and we put him in a particular setting and stuff. Let's just use the Harlem Renaissance
Right.
as an example. We go through that framing and everything too. Now, what would you say your aim was for challenging some assertions of Harrison not just in, but roughly around the Harlem Renaissance and expanding that
Mm.
notion of his black radical thought even more so into the
Hmm.
20th century?
Absolutely. Well, it's funny because Hubert Harrison once made a comment about it. He said, "The matter of a Negro literary renaissance is like the snakes of Ireland. There isn't any."
Oh,
And so that kind of struck me because I was like, okay, what does he mean by that? And what I realized is he wasn't saying that there was no interesting arts and culture coming out of Harlem in the 1920s. What he was saying was that people who were peddling this Negro Renaissance narrative, people like Alain Locke, for example, and Paul Kellogg, the publisher of the Survey Graphic magazine, Albert Boney, who publishes the New Negro anthology that Locke's magazine became. The people peddling this Renaissance narrative were essentially demonstrating their ignorance about the rich history and tradition of Black literary production going back to the 19th century, right? And Harrison actually dared anybody to pick a single decade from 1850 all the way up to 1920 or 19, whenever this so-called Renaissance was happening. And he dared people to show him a decade that didn't have even higher quality, if not higher quantity literature than the 1920s when this so-called Renaissance was being declared. And his argument was basically that the Renaissance narrative was a marketing strategy by white publishers to try to sell token examples of non-threatening and patriotic Negro art to white audiences and white markets, right? And it's what's funny about this whole story, apart from the fact that, there's a so-called Harlem Renaissance that everybody thinks about and never thinks about the Renaissance man par excellence in Harlem, which would be Hubert Harrison, is that many of the people, not just Harrison, but many of the other people, Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, Zora Neale Hurston, who were touted as examples or symbols of this so-called Renaissance later repudiated it and actually recognized it for, as even Alain Locke would call it, a Negrophile fad,
Mm.
right? This kind of trendy, sudden interest among white folks in the Negro and the arts and culture that the Negro were producing, but which actually was very hollow. And in fact, unfortunately for people like Harrison, did a lot of work to erase the
Yes.
the real New Negro movement, which was, a more radical and politically conscious type of movement where you had black socialists and black communists and Garveyists and blues women and all these kind of formations in the post-World War I era of political awakening that the New Negro, the original kind of New Negro movement in Harlem, which Harrison was in many ways a spearhead of, that's what was really going on prior to this kind of revisionist history that basically erased all of that and just proclaimed a renaissance in order to actually avoid dealing with the complex questions of race and class and imperialism that Black folks had woken up to after the First World War.
You know, I'm glad you really you brought up the issue of race and class, and I think those, and in reading your book, that
Mm,
connection, right, definitely
mm,
there. I mean, and how could it not be? That when I think about this, we know that Harrison was known for linking race and class struggles together.
hmm.
As part of what he did, and not along and everything too. In thinking about your work and thinking about your book, what would you tell folks about how your work illustrates the ways that race and class were navigated between the socialists, the labor, and folks dealing with black liberation.
Hmm.
And that's a tricky thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is one of the key themes of the book, certainly. Because Harrison is emerging at a time when there's extreme inequality, right? You have the robber barons of the Gilded Age, people like Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan and Andrew Carnegie and Vanderbilt, who are essentially the billionaire oligarchs of Harrison's time, right? They were getting extremely wealthy, and there was a rampant exploitation of steel workers, convict laborers, timber workers, mine workers, child labor was a thing. And this produced a political awakening and radicalization such that organizations like the Industrial Workers of the World began to grow rapidly, this radical labor union that was trying to put all workers into one big union to challenge capitalism. You have the rise of the Socialist Party, right? This is the heyday, really the heyday of the Socialist Party of America when Eugene Debs was their perennial presidential candidate. He wins, 6% of the vote in 1912, which is the highest percentage of the vote that a socialist candidate has ever gotten in U.S. history. And Harrison, this is the party that Harrison is joining. It's a growing party. It's a large party, right? They have, over 100,000 members, I believe it was by 1910 or 1915. And of course, there's different factions within it, right? So
Oh,
when it comes to racial politics in the socialists camp, you have some who are openly racist, right? Some socialists who are literally supporting lynching as a means to deal with what they see as the quote unquote hypersexualized black male who is a threat to white women and white masculinity. Then you have some socialists who are, more sort of race neutral, I would say. And that was really the best you could get at that time. I mean, people like Eugene Debs, for example, who was on the left wing of the Socialist Party, a more radical, coming out of the labor movement, out of the Pullman strike, right? Debs, as powerful as he was as a speaker and an orator and a presidential candidate, he also said that the Socialist Party has nothing special to offer the Negro because the class struggle is colorless. And so this is where Harrison comes in with a black angle of vision on socialism, right? And a socialist angle of vision on black communities to say, look, you as a party, we as a party, because Harrison is a part of the party, he's saying we need to take black workers more seriously and to question the specificity of anti-black racial oppression. Because at this time, we're talking about the Jim Crow era, right? We're talking about the preponderance of lynching. the massive disenfranchisement of black rights, voting rights in the South, Jim Crow segregation, right, in the South, and of course, a spate of pogroms and anti-black massacres throughout the North and West and all over the country. And so Harrison is like, look, we need to take black workers seriously and develop a special outreach program to them. Harrison founds the Colored Socialist Club in Harlem in order to recruit black workers and organizers into the party. And unfortunately, the moderate, middle class, and white party leadership found it very difficult to actually take seriously the radical working class and black voice of Harrison and became threatened by what he was doing and essentially persecuted him, to make a longer story short, persecuted him and drove him out of the party.
Hmm.
And Harrison felt like this was a betrayal of socialist principles because they were claiming to be class first, class first politics, right? You put the working class above all else. But as Harrison pointed out, black folks are the most thoroughly proletarian element in the country, the most thoroughly working class element in the country, and the most thoroughly exploited section of the working class. And it's not difficult to understand why, right? Most people of African descent were brought here as enslaved people, brought here to do work, brought here to be at the bottom of the working class. And so, unfortunately, they failed to heed his call, which is why he ends up leaving the Socialist Party, founding the Liberty League of Negro Americans, which was an all-black organization based on an internationalist program supporting, colonized peoples around the world, a race first or Africa first political orientation, and fighting for the rights that were denied by the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, the post-Civil War amendments that were supposed to make black folks equal, but never did. He was saying we need to actually fight lynching, fight segregation, and fight for a real democracy in this country, which would basically imply a revolution startling to think of. And then Marcus Garvey comes, right, joins Harrison's Liberty League, learns all that strategy and tactics, and uses it to build the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, into the largest international organization of African people that we've ever seen, right? With tens of thousands of members along both banks of the Atlantic Ocean. And so Black nationalism in that sense, or at least the Garveyist valence of Black nationalism, is in many ways grows out of a reaction to the lack of respect for Black folks in the Socialist Party, right? Because as Harrison put it, he said they're claiming to put class first, but actually they're putting race first. They're putting the white race, the white working class first. So they're actually race first, and therefore we as black people need to be race first when it comes to black folks, because all these white political sort of tendencies, whether you're conservative, whether you're liberal, whether you're radical like a socialist, all these white folks are putting the white race first and black folks after. So therefore, we're going to put black folks first and then deal with, the other issues that may come up afterwards. And so that's kind of an interesting way of thinking about how Garveyism or Black nationalism more generally grows out of the kind of white nationalism that denies Black folks positions and opportunities within their institutions, right? It's just like the church. There would never have been a need for a Black church if the white church wasn't so racially exclusionary and racist towards black people, and denying them any positions, any status in the church prior to the formation of the black church, right? So just like we needed a black church as against the white churches, we needed a kind of black nationalist or black internationalist politics as against the white nationalist, white internationalism of, in this case, the Socialist Party.
There are a couple things you touched on there, and it kind of got my mind percolating a little bit too, particularly thinking about, the structure and dynamics of the Garveyites, who will have a huge impact, we know later,
Yeah.
to the rise of the NOI, the Nation of Islam, and some of the
Uh-huh.
elements that will happen there, and particularly the way they condemn socialism
Yeah.
in,
Yeah.
in a lot of ways too. One thing you pointed out, you reminded me in your book, and you did this so wonderful. I don't know about you, but I remember back in my undergrad when I was in high school, the narratives of teachers, how they would just talk about the amazing things about the robber barons and these captains of industry, all of
Yeah.
this stuff.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you wrote so beautifully and I believe this is earlier in the book, that
Hmm.
these captains of industry are not good people. It doesn't matter what your race is. They're
Mm.
about greed in themselves and building up their own wealth that's there. Which so I
Hmm.
just want to
Hmm.
holler at you for really pointing that out. You mentioned, of course, when Harrison leaves the Socialist Party after being rejected, and we know something I know a little bit about is W.B. Du Bois will join the Socialist Party, and he
Yeah.
won't last very long.
Yeah.
For a lot of the reasons why that you pointed out, right? Especially in the South, they didn't speak against lynching. They were
Mm.
segregated clubs and groups among the Socialist Party. All of those things happening, and Du Bois, who corresponded with Debs, didn't vote for Debs, but changed parties and joined the Democrats and
Uh-huh.
voted for Woodrow Wilson, who would be one of the worst presidents in the history for Black people,
Right.
for that to transpire.
Right.
So when you think about all of that's happening and everything, I've got to ask you, oh brother, you let your readers know the problems of W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I love to hear a little bit about that. Particularly thinking about the fact that, and I want to see if I can remember this correctly, and just correct me if I'm wrong here. That I want to say you articulated a framing of one of the greatest Black intellectuals of the first half of the 20th century by describing that he turned his back on Black folks, on lynching, of the challenges that
Mm.
folks gave it, that folks wrestle with for his own agenda.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Du Bois is an important figure and a complex figure, and one who undergoes a number of changes throughout the course of his life. I mean, I really love the Du Bois of the 1930s onward. When he's writing Black Reconstruction,
Right.
when he,
After 35, moving forward.
yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Du Bois does this unusual thing, which is he becomes more radical as he gets into his old age, right? Most people become less radical and more conservative with time. Du Bois actually became more and more radical over time, and so I credit him for that because it's such a rare thing to do. But certainly in the first 2 decades, 3 decades of the 20th century, when Harrison was alive, right? Hubert Harrison dies in 1927. During Harrison's lifetime, Du Bois was not particularly radical. He was more of a kind of liberal, I would say a liberal, for lack of a better word. Yes, he did dabble in the Socialist Party, but as you said, he got sucked into the logic of lesser evilism and voted for Woodrow Wilson, an arch racist, segregationist Southerner, and so it's an example of what those politics can lead you to do. But World War I is really the crucible for Harrison's relationship to Du Bois and clash that they have, right? Because prior to the U.S. entering World War I in 1917, Du Bois was universally seen as kind of the big Black influencer of the day, right? He was the editor of the NAACP's Crisis magazine, which was raising a lot of concern about the special grievances of African Americans when it came to lynching, when it came to segregation, when it came to disfranchisement, and when it came to anti-Black pogroms and massacres. Um, but of course, what ends up happening is that and by the way, one of the things I have to just say is that a lot of people don't realize this, but the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was founded by elite white liberals.
Yes. Well, it was an interracial moving out of the Niagara movement, right? Absolutely.
Yes, yes, but when you look at the personnel who actually, came together, Mary White Ovington and William
Yes.
English Walling and all these people, they were essentially white liberals. Du Bois was the only Black person on the initial board of the NAACP. As editor of the Crisis, he was given some role, but he was one in a sea of 8 or 9, other white folks on the board, and so that's telling when you look at the NAACP's behavior and its kind of moderate and liberal orientation down through the years. But in any case, when the U.S. enters World War I, President Wilson says we need to quote unquote make the world safe for democracy. Of course, there was no democracy for Black folks in the South, especially. But Du Bois initially is maintaining the line he had before the war, which is that we need to keep pressing our grievances, But eventually, the U.S. Government passes the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which make dissent and anti-war views basically illegal, to the point where you could be arrested, you could be jailed, you could be imprisoned, even deported for speaking against the war, just like many socialists and communists and anarchists were arrested, imprisoned, deported. I'm talking about Eugene Debs, I'm talking about Emma Goldman, A. Philip Randolph, right? A whole number of folks. And so Du Bois, looking at the state repression, decides to basically moderate his tone, just as the government explicitly asked him to. And he ends up actually trying to join the government. His boss, Joel Spingarn, who was chairman of the board of the NAACP, one of the white liberal figures that I mentioned, Joel Spingarn becomes a major in U.S. military intelligence during the war, and he tries to get to Du Bois to join him. And so Du Bois ends up applying to become a captain in military intelligence in order to police and monitor and surveil Negro subversion, quote
So,
unquote,
hey, can
right?
I ask you something real fast about that point, though?
Yeah, sure,
Right,
sure.
and not that I'm disagreeing with you on that, but would you say that was more of an interpretation in the way Black folks felt about the boys than what he was actually doing, especially in terms of assuming that he was surveilling and gaining engaged in the surveillance states of Black folks, which was a prevailing attitude there?
Yeah, actually there was a rigorous effort on the part of the government to coerce and cajole and surveil and police the boundaries of black acceptable black opinion during the war. So, for example, they called an editors' conference. They got all the black editors of all the major black newspapers together, including Du Bois as editor of The Crisis, to basically make sure they were going to toe a patriotic line during the war. There was state repression. I mentioned they imprisoned A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen for giving anti-war speeches. They ended up getting off because the judge didn't believe Negroes could utter such things. And the NAACP itself underwent an internal audit. I mean, it's a fascinating fact of life that the chairman of the board of the NAACP was also a major level rank in military intelligence. I'm talking about Joel Spingarn. And he went through an audited all the branches, all the chapters of the NAACP to weed out any dissidents, to weed out, to make sure that, that the organization could have a clean bill of health in the eyes of the US government during the war. And Du Bois becomes a part of that, unfortunately, and to his credit, Du Bois regretted what he did for the rest of his life. He writes this editorial in 1918, the infamous Close Ranks editorial, where he says, "Let us, while this war lasts, close our ranks and forget our special grievances as we, get behind the war effort." And this is something that Harrison exposed in an article called The Descent of Dr. Du Bois, where he basically said, look, Du Bois is selling out here, but he's doing so telling us to forget our special grievances as black folks during the war because he's applying to become a military intelligence captain. He's trying to join the government, right? He is basically selling black folks out for his own interest so that he can draw a salary both from the NAACP and from the government at the same time. And it blew up in Du Bois's face, in part because Harrison and others like William Monroe Trotter exposed what was happening behind the scenes. And it really did damage Du Bois's standing in the eyes of black folks because they felt like it'd be like if today, for example, somebody that we really respect, maybe a Cornell West or a Ta-Nehisi Coates or an Angela Davis or somebody who we really respect suddenly starts towing the line for Israel and saying, well, Israel's got to defend itself, it's facing a war of annihilation and they have to do whatever they, right? Like we would be shocked if an Angela Davis or a Cornell West or a Ta-Nehisi Coates came out defending Israel, right? But if we understood that they were applying for a government job and saw this as part of their audition, we would understand why they're doing that. We wouldn't be happy about it, but it would make more sense. And so this is what Harrison was able to do. He was able to explain to people why it is that Du Bois is basically taking this stance that feels like betrayal and sellout. And as I said, Du Bois, to his credit, regretted that moment for the rest of his life. And I believe it was a critical part of how he actually became more radical, right? You don't become more radical in your thinking because you never face criticism. You become more radical in your thinking because you actually face criticism for people who are more radical than you, right? People who are to your left. It's when you hear from that side, then you realize, oh, I messed up. I made a mistake here. And to his credit, as I said, he became more radical subsequently, I think because of the intervention and action of people like Hubert Harrison, who were able to say, nah, we can't have Negro leaders who decide based on which way the wind is blowing, whether they are going to fight for us or not. We need Negro leaders who are going to fight for us no matter which way the wind is blowing.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a telling point, right? Because essentially you're telling folks that, you got Du Bois and you got someone who, a bit moderate, not quite radical, more liberal in this particular sense, who needed to be pushed and moved in a
Yes,
direction. And,
yes,
it wasn't going to be, I mean, Washington was quite conservative and problematic in his own ways. He's dead by
yes,
1915.
yes.
Marcus Garvey's dead, but a couple years before Harrison dies, I think. Am I
No,
wrong?
no, 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 no.
Garvey died.
Garvey comes on the scene a bit later.
I'm sorry, no, Garvey comes on the scene in the 20s and dies a little
Yeah,
bit. Yeah,
yeah,
I
yeah.
switched that, absolutely.
Hmm,
And
hmm.
then you get to the point too, where you think about, well, as the voice is moving, we need to kind of rethink and reframe this picture. And so, and that brings me to this question here that I'm curious about. Why do you think Hubert Harrison has been so overlooked? And I know your scholarship, your book is going to help folks kind of figure this out. But most people,
Mm,
I mean, I'm going to even say a lot of historians, even who don't do this kind of work, don't
right,
know who this brother is.
right, right. Yeah, I mean it's the inevitable question. As soon as you start looking into Hubert Harrison, one of the first things you realize is like, okay, this person is fascinating and really important. And also, why have I never heard of him before? And why aren't more people talking about him? And
Did,
why hasn't it?
did you had you heard of him as an undergrad and in high school?
No, absolutely not. It wasn't until I was in a socialist group and the newspaper we had, the Socialist Worker, published a review of Jeff Perry's first volume of the Harrison biography. Uh,
Oh, which is I haven't read it. I have a copy of his, and it just a shout out to that late brother. I think Jeff passed away about a year ago or so.
Yeah, yeah, about 2 years ago.
Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, I will also pay homage to Perry because, if it wasn't for Perry, I would not have known about Harrison. I would not have become so interested in Harrison. And Perry laid an extraordinary foundation in terms of the two-volume biography that he has out, which is meticulous and detailed like a reference work.
Mhm.
At the same time, it's nearly 1,200 pages between the two volumes, not including footnotes. And so for the general reader, that's a steep hill to climb, which is one of the reasons why my book, I think, is more accessible in that it's geared for a general audience, not just scholars or academics, but people who just want to learn about Harrison, some of the main themes of his life, why he matters, why he's important. And to your question, why he's been so marginalized and erased in the popular memory is because, every movement that he participated in, even ones that he helped found and form and shape, like the Garvey movement, have had their own reasons not to remember him, often because he made sharp criticisms of those movements during or even after his participation. So he was sharply critical of the Socialist Party. Their racial politic, the limitations of their race politics. Socialist Party didn't want to remember him. He was sharply critical of the so-called Renaissance narrative, right? So the Harlem Renaissance, people who canonized, that framework didn't want to remember him. Harrison, although he was decisive in catalyzing the rise of Garvey and Garveyism, Harrison became quite critical of Marcus Garvey, so the Garveyists didn't want to remember him. So, you go down the list and you realize that all of these major movements, the largest class radical movement, the largest race radical movement, the sort of reawakening of arts and culture in Black communities, he played massive roles in stimulating all these things. But because he became critical and wasn't willing to hold his tongue, right, or pull punches about that, they decided not to remember him. And Du Bois is another perfect example. Look in the entire archive of the crisis. You won't find a single mention of Hubert Henry Harrison, in part because of the kind of clashes and contestations that Harrison engaged, which exposed the fact that Du Bois was, attempting to sell out his people during World War I, right? There's reasons why these folks didn't want Harrison remembered. But it makes studying Harrison all the more interesting because you get to see all these hidden corners and new angles of vision, and you realize how much history has been hidden, how much has been erased, how much has been written out or marginalized in our sort of common understanding.
I am glad you mentioned that, my friend. Let me tell you, I my eyes just got big. So I'm combing through every word, every space, everything from my book through every issue of the Crisis magazine right now. I'm in the midst of that. I had no idea the boys never mentioned the brother's name one time in there. That is fascinating. You know, when we think
Mm,
about Harrison here, and I got a question for you. So, Professor Philip Luke Senator, and we're chatting about your brilliant scholarship and your wonderful book. A question that he was curious about, and I want to ask this question. How, in thinking about your teaching, how did teaching Harrison in the classroom influence, shape your eventual interpretation of his life, thought, and politics,
mm,
and even vice versa? How did
mm.
that influence how you inform your students in a way in which you were never influenced that way because you didn't know about him until you started delving into the work of Jeffrey Perry?
Right, right. Well, I mean, Harrison was above all else an educator, someone who really sought to teach and educate the people. And so he would speak on street corners in Harlem. I have a whole chapter called The Outdoor Grioversity, which describes the culture of oral, street corner speaking and stepladder oratory, which Harrison was one of the pioneers and trailblazers for, because he had a genius level intellect, and he would read in all kinds of different subjects, and he would take all that information in, and then he would give it to the people. He would literally teach on street corners, multiple nights a week, everything from global geopolitics to, literary criticism of Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, to African history and ancient African civilizations, to, the politics of sexuality. He was a free lover. I hope we can talk a little bit about Harrison's Black free love politics before we're done here. So Harrison taught on this wide range of things, and I could relate to that as a teacher. There's a lot of ways, as you saw in my preface, there's a lot of ways that I can relate to Hubert Harrison, as a person of African descent, as a person who has studied different languages, but as a teacher is one of the big ways. My mother was a teacher. I have a master's degree in teaching. I taught high school for a number of years before I went back for my PhD so that I could teach undergrads, which I'm now doing, as a university professor. And so teaching for me, when I'm teaching about Harrison, it's a joy because I'm teaching about another teacher, in fact, another master teacher. And his thought and his politics is so multidimensional that it really gives us a beautiful way of understanding how you even get the kind of knowledge that is useful. And so if I can just share a quote, this is Harrison
Please
speaking.
do. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, this is a quote from the book, from the introduction, page 27, where Harrison is describing how you get the kind of knowledge that is powerful. And he's speaking specifically to the youth. And in his words, the task of young people was to get education, quote, not only in school and college, but in books and newspapers, in marketplaces, institutions, and movements. Prepare by knowing and never think you know until you've listened to 10 others who know differently and have survived the shock. That to me is like a Harrisonian methodology, right? Like you think you know something, all right, test it against 10 other folks who know differently and see if you still know what you thought you knew. And if you do, if you do still know what you thought you knew, that means you're solid, right? But if you hear something from one of those 10 other folks who knows differently, you may want to modify your thinking. You may want to revise your theories and hypotheses in the light of new information, right? In the light of new experiences or new data. Like revise yourself so that you can actually know what you claim to know and not just be, speaking out of the side of your head or something like that. You know what I mean? And so I've tried to employ that methodology myself. When I hear about something I don't know or I'm not well versed on, I say to myself, let me lean in and investigate this rather than take a position right now, either for or against, right? I think too often we'll dismiss things out of hand without doing any research or without actually having the curiosity and the intellectual interest in what's being presented. And so that's how I try to teach with and about Harrison is using a Harrisonian method, right? When it comes to politics, like, okay, you have this political position, let's test it against a few others and see if it survives the shock. Because if not, then I'm gonna have a hard time investing in that political position. You
No,
see
I
what I'm saying?
appreciate. No, I get it too. And I mean, again, talking about knowledge and leaning in and discovering things you just You don't know, right?
Hmm.
And I'm pointing a
Hmm.
finger at myself and really trying to figure that out. So you had something you were curious about. You wanted us to delve into. What was that again?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I just wanted people to know that in addition to Harrison's, class radicalism in the Socialist Party, his race radicalism with the Garvey movement, his religious free-thinking radicalism, he had a strong critique of the church and Christianity. He was also a free lover. He was a sex radical, right? First of all, let's just lay it out, okay? He's the first black figure in U.S. history to number one, call for the decriminalization of access to contraception, right? Contraception was illegal alongside a whole lot of other things related to sex. Erotica was illegal, you know, books and novels and films that depicted too many sexual themes were made illegal by the Comstock laws. So Harrison is the first black figure, as far as I can tell, in U.S. history to call for decriminalizing access to contraception and denouncing church and state repression of sexuality, right? Because it wasn't just the state and the Comstock laws that were sexually repressive. It was also the church, which had a very puritanical, sex negative morality. Harrison is the first to give a public-facing lecture series on sex education, right? 1917, which I have in the book in my chapter on Harrison's free love politics. That's notable when we're thinking about the history of sex education, and in particular in African American communities. That's not something that a lot of people have focused on. And Harrison is another first, as far as I can tell. He's the first to explicitly articulate a defense of free love, that is a love style based on variety and freedom, as against compulsory monogamy on the grounds that, as he put it, we are not monogamists by nature, right? This idea that we are only monogamists because of the coercion from church and state and capitalism, right? This idea of the nuclear family, the sort of idea that you privatize the family, and that's a way for the ruling class to know who to pass down their wealth to, right? Donald Trump wants to know that it's Barron Trump that gets some of his wealth. He doesn't want to have to figure out amongst all the other people that he's messed with, some of which in very abusive and problematic situations. So it's a monogamy for women only in that sense, right? Because the ruling class men could always do whatever they wanted. It's that they wanted to know who their heirs were, who their quote unquote legitimate heirs were going to be. And so that's why in the book I point out that Harrison is not arguing against the idea of monogamy, but compulsory monogamy,
Right.
right? The idea that you take this one particular format of, relating exclusively romantically and sexually with one person at a time and saying, well, everybody has to do that, that this is a one size fits all policy, which disavows the vast range of sexualities and erotic energy exchange traditions that existed amongst indigenous peoples all over the world. I'm not just talking about polygamy, which still exists in many places, right? Plural marriage, having more than one spouse. That's one example of non-monogamy, but there's so many others, right? And then when we get into, for example, the way that indigenous cultures treated people who we think in the West of as quote unquote LGBT or queer. There's a wide range of ways those folks were treated in a pre-colonial context as well. I mean, the Dagara people in Burkina Faso are one example. They called these folks gatekeepers, meaning they had the keys to the gates between the material world and the spirit world. And they were seen as having spiritually elevated capacity because of their sexual fluidity in ways that were respected in the community. They had a role to play in the community. They could balance masculine, feminine imbalances in the community. They could be peacemakers, right? They could be people who actually had a role to play and were not persecuted. We're not seen as less than or something wrong. That's what colonialism brought, right? European colonizers imposed a sex negative morality, a compulsory monogamy and Christian ethos about sex, making monogamy the be all and end all when it comes to sex, love, and marriage in ways that it never had been in indigenous people in Africa or Asia or Latin America. And so I think Harrison's politics here are powerful because they push us to a frontier of critical thought that many of us have never even considered, even those of us who think of ourselves as radical and revolutionary. In other words, Harrison was able to connect capitalism and colonialism and white supremacy and Christianity to compulsory monogamy, that it's all part of a single package deal that has to be rejected if we want true liberation, right? In other words, we're never going to get political liberation or economic liberation if we don't also aim for and achieve some level of sexual liberation, because at the end of the day, no one's going to get free unless we're all free, as our great, wisdom from the Ella Bakers and Fannie Lou Hamers, as they put it, right? If we're not going to get free until we all get free, then questions of sexual liberation are germane not just to queer folks, right, or LGBT folks, or two-spirit, or whatever. It's for all of us, right?
I mean, and that comes down to the challenge too. And right, your book really deals a lot with thinking about liberation, particularly Black liberation, and what does that look like? And as you
Yeah.
really kind of expanded this focus from the influence of a person who, in many ways, a lot of folks don't know. How do we kind of delve back and think about it? And it's part of our culture wars that are taking place right now. I mean, you just described that struggle from folks who want to see us progress and move in one direction, folks who don't want to see that type of progression that's happening here. I mean, we're both, right? We're here in the American South where there's a lot of resistance, and a lot of times that resistance really does kind of culminate around the notion of race. Because I mean, I think
Hmm.
race is just ubiquitous. It's like,
Hmm.
you think you're going to have a bowl of cereal and you got Raisin Brands and all that stuff, and you're going to eat them without it. It's always going to be there. Well, my friend, as we are getting to the end of this episode, which has been absolutely fantastic, my friend, I have learned so much from you. Your book, talking to you. I mean, you've said a couple pieces here just on this show that I'm blown away by. I didn't know. And I like
Mm.
the fact that you've challenged me, like you've challenged my audience and other folks to be learned people. Make sure you know what you don't know and delve in to explore that a little bit more. And so,
Yeah.
one of the things that I like to do with all of my guests is this. Well, you know what? Before I ask this question, I,
Yeah.
I got to ask this. How can people find your book?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, if folks want to, order directly from the publisher, which is University of North Carolina Press, if you just go to uncpress.org, you can search my name, Brian Kwoba, or Hubert Harrison. The book will come up, and you can use the code 01social30. That's 01SOCIAL 30 to save 30% at checkout. You can also go to my website if you want just more information about me and my work, briankwoba.com, BrianKwoba.com. I'm on Instagram at dr.kwoba. So yeah, if folks want to get the book, please, but also get a sense of me that I'm definitely online. And one thing I want to just say quickly about that is that you're buying more than a book. You're
Mm-hmm.
buying a piece of my heart and soul because I poured, 12 years of research, writing, revision, rewriting, editing, right? Like it's a lot of work to produce something like this, and it's very difficult to try to restore and reclaim somebody as rare as Hubert Harrison, as multidimensional as Hubert Harrison. I am confident in this work because I know that I put the time in, and so I just really want to invite folks to see this as more than just buying a book in that sense, because really what we're doing is invoking an ancestor and restoring him, hopefully, to his rightful place among all the other folks, of his time. That he's the credit that he's been denied, right? The sort of the influence that people haven't even been aware of that he's had on so many of the cutting edge movements of his day.
So and before I give the last thought to you, I've got to ask this, and I'm curious. When did the book come out?
It just came out in June. The official date, release date was June 17th, so just about 2 months ago.
Okay, so all right, so it's fresh off the press and everything. Because I mean, I was just
Hmm.
thinking, because I didn't know about your relationship with Jeff Perry and Jeff Perry and I. We've corresponded a good bit over the last number of years.
Mm,
Social media in different spaces.
mm,
He was always great at responding to my correspondence when I had a question or a thought. We were on social media together, and he would kind of chime in sometimes and say, brother, I
mm.
see where you're going. I see what you're thinking here. Let me add a little fuel for thought just for you to chew on and everything too. And then
Uh-huh.
when I learned that he passed away, I was devastated.
Hmm.
I think it would have been really powerful, um, had he been around to see your work and to really grasp and understand the influence he had on you in thinking about this too. And I'm sure there are a lot of other folks, and you pointed that out in the acknowledgments. I appreciate how you delved into thinking about language, going through the book and everything, which is important too, because language
Yep.
does matter.
Yep. Yeah, well, I have to, I have to be honest that I have mixed feelings about Perry, because as much as he was foundational to my knowing about Harrison and deciding
Yes.
to study Harrison, Perry also treated Harrison like his private property in particular ways, and this is something that I only learned about through mentors like Robin D.G. Kelley, who knew more of the backstory than I did. Which is that Perry, to his credit, he got the descendants of Harrison to open up Harrison's papers to him, but then he sat on those papers and wouldn't let other scholars look at them for years and years, for decades, right? Eventually, he deposited some chunk of them to Columbia, what is now the Hubert Harrison papers of Columbia University. But for a long time, he wouldn't allow scholars, including Black scholars like Robert D.G. Kelley and others, to look at those papers. So anytime you have a white person treating a Black archive as their private property, that
Yes.
is problematic. And that is one of the differences between my work and Perry's. I'm coming at Harrison from an unapologetically Black and African angle of vision. Perry was coming at Harrison from that of an Irish American socialist and labor organizer, which, are important sides of Harrison's significance, his labor activism, his socialist politics. But there's more to the story when it comes to Harrison. And so this is the first book-length treatment of Hubert Harrison by a Black scholar. And I think, people who read the book will see why that is relevant and how it leads me into areas of Harrison's thought that Perry wasn't even really adequately addressing in as much as he did some great work and did a lot of work. Harrison is a complex figure, and you need more than one perspective to really understand him.
Oh, I appreciate that. Again, that's something I didn't know. That's great information to glean from and to take in. So as we come to the end here, Race Matters here at 96.3 Joppa Radio. I want to thank folks for leaning into I mean, y'all are listening to a brilliant brother, folks. I'm telling you, who's just written a fantastic work. Brian, I'm going to give you the last word, as I do with all my guests. What are your last thoughts that you would like to offer for listeners, people who may be viewing this?
Well, I will defer to one of my mentors and supporters who I just mentioned, Robin D.G. Kelley, because he said something that just is so moving about this book. The first blurb on the back cover for folks who have it, he said, Brian Kwoba has written a beautiful intellectual biography as radical and original as its subject.
Mm.
Now, coming from Kelly, right, who among other things wrote Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination. Um, for Robin D.G. Kelley to say that I've done something as radical and original as Harrison in this book, like that's just an extraordinary vote of confidence, and it means a lot to me because I feel like that's what I was aiming to do. I was aiming to do something that met the moment and the significance of, putting out a book on a figure like this, right? I often tell people like one of the reasons we haven't had more books on Harrison is because once you start to study him, you realize, oh, this is a serious undertaking, right? In other words, you better come correct or don't come at all, right? Like don't half-ass anything if you're gonna be working with an ancestor like this. You got to come correct, and I believe that I've done that. I'm confident in the work, and as I said, folks, I think are really going to, no matter what your politics are, I think there's a lot of history in this book, a lot of hidden history, a lot of ideas, a lot of arguments that will stimulate you one way or the other, right? Hopefully going to teach you a lot. It's hopefully going to empower you and inspire you, as well as challenge you to grow more, because that's really what Harrison offers us. He challenges us to grow, to go deeper, right, and to expand our thinking and to empower ourselves for social change and for transformation.
Folks, this is Race Matters. Thank you for chiming in, and we'll see you next episode.
Thank you.